few years after she was toppled from power, Margaret Thatcher was asked what she had changed in Britain, and she replied, everything. The interesting paradox in that remark is that she didn't begin her political career or even her time in number 10 Downing Street from 1979 by wanting to change everything. And when she did change everything, it was in a completely different way from that which I think she desired or even believed she has changed everything. She began simply by wanting to curb union power and restore certain aspects of balanced budgets, Victorian public housekeeping, you might say, in public expenditure. She had relatively limited goals, and it was only by towards the end of the 80s, in fact not long before she was in fact toppled from power by her own party, that she became something like a revolutionary of the right, trying to transform British society. But even in at that period, there was a paradox. She wanted to revolutionize the economy, but at the same time to restore patterns of social and family life based on deference, hierarchy, and authority, and stable relationships within the family and in society in general, while at the same time unleashing all of the subversive and highly innovative forces of the free market. And of course, these two aspects of her policies couldn't be reconciled. So she ended up by changing everything, or at least accelerating changes in society that were perhaps going on anyway, in such a way that the sort of Arcadia she wanted to return to, the kind of stuffy, slightly stodgy 1950s Britain she wanted to revive, was consigned to the memory hole of history forever by the very free market she'd brought into being.
The way in which she changed the economy then changed the way people live their lives, and not in ways which she would originally have approved of.
The way in which Thatcher changed the economy was to remove or weaken fetters and controls which curbed market choice, both for consumers, investors, the city, and producers. She spread choice, sometimes the illusion of choice, but on other occasions the reality of choice, and in any case the idea of choice, right throughout the whole culture. And of course, if you do that in the economy and it spreads into the larger culture of which the economy is a part, then ideas of family duty, of loyalty to relationships, of long-term planning even in one's life become rather tenuous. The thing that matters more than anything else, the value to which everyone bows in a society based on the free market, is personal choice, personal self-realization. Whereas the sort of society Margaret Thatcher admired and thought she was restoring was a society in which personal choice and personal self-realization were not central. What was central was ideas of duty to one's parents and to one's children, ideas of rootedness, and ideas of deference and hierarchy in society, ideas in which were embodied in authoritative institutions. So by uncorking the bottle of choice and letting the genie of self-realization out of the bottle, Margaret Thatcher created a society in which figures like Madonna, media phenomena such as reality television, the I want it now gratification society became the norm.
Now, when she came to power in May 1979, you felt she was necessary because the post-war settlement had failed. What do you mean by that?
When Margaret Thatcher came to power in May 1979, it had already been clear for several years that the type of economic settlement that had existed in Britain since the Second World War had foundered and failed. The first senior British politician to grasp that fact fully was not Margaret Thatcher, but Dennis Healey, a great British politician, considerably greater than his own party, who understood that the old settlement based on a sort of triangular relationship between employers, workers and government, and embodied in high-spending Keynesian policies which were meant to produce high levels of employment, wasn't working anymore. And in fact, that became clear in the mid-70s when the IMF was called in and a program of economic reforms attempted. But Labour proved unable to bring about a new settlement. Labour proved, because of its close links with the trade unions, lacked the capacity to do so, so Healey's vision foundered. What Thatcher did and how she, as it were, came into being in Britain was she took over the baton of union and economic reform, a relatively limited, though very important task, from Labour in general and from Dennis Healey in particular, which had been unable to actually implement it, and implemented it. So the actual agenda of the early agenda of Margaret Thatcher was not her own creation. It didn't involve privatization, which was not even mentioned in the election manifesto of 1979. It was really the agenda of Dennis Healey, which Labour had proved unable to implement.
And you believe her legacy was irreversible. Why do you believe that?
Thatcher's economic and political legacy is in several important respects irreversible for two reasons. First of all, as she understood, and as Dennis Healey understood before her, the post-war settlement, the old-fashioned forms of social democracy and one-nation Toryism have gone for good. There have been too many changes in the world, and for that matter, too many changes in British society. And in fact, the types of ways of life with which they were associated have gone as well. Women have moved ahead in the economy, so have ethnic minorities. Britain, already by the 80s and certainly by the 90s and certainly now, is not an homogeneous, highly cohesive society. It's a highly individualistic, globalized society. So the general conditions of the world, and this is really the second reason why her inheritance is irreversible. The world as a whole has moved on in ways which reinforced the innovative and, so to speak, subversive or revolutionary aspect of Thatcher's legacy. Let me see. I may have to. Let me get it quite right. I'll put it in a slightly different way.
Okay.
Might be.
Yep.
The majority of Tories and the great majority of people on the left took for granted when Thatcher came to power that she was a blip on the screen of history, that she was a sort of aberration in British politics, and that whatever she might do would soon be reversed, and there would be a kind of return to political and economic and social normalcy. I believed in 1979 that was a profound mistake, partly because the world which had existed before the early 70s, in the post-war period, the post-war settlement which had existed from 1945 onwards, had already broken down by 1974, 1975, 1976. It was already history. Nothing had yet replaced it, but it was gone for good. So that old world, the old Britain of a rather patronizing hierarchical one-nation Toryism, or a rather corporatist, stagnant old Labour settlement, that world has already gone for good. So there was never a question of returning to it. And what Thatcher did, both in her early period, when she mainly attacked trade union power, and later on, when she launched an excessive, to my mind, ideological assault on British institutions generally, those two phases of her career really changed everything in Britain. As she herself said, she did in fact change everything in Britain, but not in the way that she wanted. She made Britain a society that she herself could barely recognise, a highly fragmented, individualistic society, heavily and deeply globalised, not terribly cohesive, in which the predominant value is personal choice or personal self-realisation. That wasn't the Britain she wanted to bring about, but it is in fact her legacy.